Welcome, everybody. I'm Deborah Lustig. I'm the academic coordinator for the Center for Research on Social Change. I'm the sponsor of today's event, and I'm also one of the coordinators of the Graduate Fellows Program here at ISSI, along with Christine Trost and David Minkus. I want to announce our next event. Chris Cepeda-Millán, who's the faculty chair of CRSC and also assistant professor of ethnic studies, will speak on his new book, Latino Mass Mobilization, Immigration, Racialization, and Activism. That's on Monday, November 27th at 12:45, and that's at the Center for the Study of Law and Society over on Piedmont Avenue. We do have some flyers for that event if you're interested, or if you want to get on our email list, we will send you reminders. If you could please turn off your cell phones or make sure that they're silent, we would all appreciate that. I'd like to thank the co-sponsor for today's event, UC Berkeley Department of Landscape Architecture and Environmental Planning. Today our guest speaker, Professor Lung-Amam, will speak for around 45 minutes, followed by a Q&A. It's our pleasure to have her back here with us since she's one of our alums. She received her PhD in Landscape Architecture and Environmental Planning here at UC Berkeley, and she's also a former graduate fellow here at ISSI. And now she's assistant professor in the Urban Studies and Planning Program and director of community development at the National Center for Smart Growth Research and Education at the University of Maryland, College Park. I'm not sure how you fit that on your business card.
I don't.
Okay. Her scholarship focuses on the link between social inequality and the built environment. She has written extensively on the topic of immigrant suburbanization, including her recent book that she's going to share with us today. And I feel like she's very prescient. She did this work several years ago in a liberal Bay Area suburb that was becoming much more diverse and where there was a lot of pushback from the long-term white residents, and, you know, really foreshadowing a lot of what happened in our country. And so she's a fortune teller, and I hope she's going to tell us something hopeful about the future today. We'll see. Other recent projects have focused on the politics of equitable development, gentrification, suburbanization of poverty, and geographies of opportunity. Her work has been supported by the Ford Foundation, Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, Environmental Protection Agency, Enterprise Community Partners, and other local, state, and federal agencies and foundations. And I think one of the strengths of her work is her ability to move between spheres, academic, policy, practice, community, and we're very excited that she's here today to talk with us about her new book, Trespassers, Asian Americans and the Battle for Suburbia.
So it is really a pleasure to be standing in this particular room with these particular people because as a former fellow here, I actually gave my practice job talk in this very same room. So it is really a full circle moment. And it's really a full circle moment to also be standing in front of many of my advisors who gave me so much feedback on this manuscript. So I consider this not my own manuscript, but really a joint project with many of the people in this room. And so thank you to Christine, Deborah, David, and Luis, who are here and who have been not only acknowledged in this room, but also in my book. So I'd like to just read briefly from the acknowledgements of the book in which I credit these very same people with so much of what is contained herein. So let me start with Luis, who's the director of the Landscape Architecture and Environmental Planning Program, and was one of my advisors for the dissertation from which this book has emerged. So Luis Mozingo, in the acknowledgements, I say, grounded me in both the worlds of theory and practice and taught me never to hold my tongue and always made time for me, even in the midst of completing 2 books of her own. Thank you, Luis. And I also, on the second page of my acknowledgements, talk about how being a part of the scholarly community here at ISSI really did shape so much of this book and so much of the trajectory of my scholarship more broadly. So I say I've been especially thankful to be a part of scholarly groups that have critically shaped how I think and write about issues of social justice. A special thanks goes to the Institute for the Study of Societal Issues at Berkeley which provided not only financial support, but an intellectual home for a lonely social change scholar. Thanks especially to Christine, David, and Deborah for caring about the whole me and for the insightful and close reads of my work and for being some of my best critics and cheerleaders. So thank you guys for having me back. This really is a very special moment for me. And hopefully for you too, because I know you've seen versions of these chapters in various forms. So thank you for having me. I apologize for the format of the presentation. It's supposed to be on PowerPoint, but we switched to PDF, so some of the visuals might not be quite as big and as bold as they might otherwise. But this book really did take shape in the context of this region, in the context of thinking about changes that were happening in neighborhoods here and thinking about the politics of development in this region. So it is especially an honor to be giving this talk in the context of a California place. But my work really began with sort of thinking about our changing suburbs and how suburbs have really reshaped themselves in the last several decades in ways that I think are pretty unexpected. If you look at the 100 largest cities in America today, the suburbs of those cities are not the Oziet and Harriet suburbs that you might think about. And in fact, those cities that have the majority of ethnic minorities, immigrants, and the poor now living in those suburbs. And Asian Americans and immigrants have been at the forefront of the changing suburbs and American cities more broadly. And for the groups that I capture in this book, which are largely Indian and Chinese foreign-born populations, the places where those changes have been most robust have been in high-tech centers like the Silicon Valley. So if you look at the maps of where where Indian and Chinese foreign-born populations are most often located, and also where immigrant high-tech entrepreneurship is most robust, you see this vast correspondence in these maps. And so much of my research has really focused here in the Silicon Valley area and on these two groups in particular. And I talk about in the book how the changes in the suburban landscape for Asian immigrants has really been a part of a remaking of the suburban American dream for a new generation of dreamers. So if we think back to the Oziet and Harriet post-war suburbs, these were largely white middle-class and working-class communities that were moving out to the suburbs and moving into mass-produced suburbs and carving out a different kind of American dream. And so part of the argument that I make in this book is that for a new generation of dreamers, for a new generation of suburbanites, that there are kinds of places and ways in which these places function that really come to constitute a different version of an American dream. And so I focus on three particular landscapes: the schools, what many people call Asian malls, and these so-called McMansions, to encapsulate the ways in which Asian immigrants are recrafting the landscape and some of the ideas and the functions and the reuses of spaces in our suburban landscapes. But the title of my book really comes out of thinking about the ways in which these places and these changes to the landscape are contested. So the idea of trespassers comes out of thinking about its very definition: those who make unwarranted or uninvited incursions into the landscape, right? This idea that suburbia might be changing, but in fact changing in ways that are highly contested and in some ways unwarranted or uninvited from the perspective of older established residents or from the perspective of planning, design, and other politics on the ground. And so I ask about the ways in which these changes to the landscape that have come alongside Asian immigration in the Silicon Valley both represent those dreams and those desires of immigrants, but in also the ways in which these processes and politics are contested on the ground. And so I forward this notion that I call landscapes of difference, and that is thinking about the ways in which these kinds of changes to the landscape represent these desires and these dreams, but also how the ways in which these differences to the suburban landscape, these non-normative or these differences are contested in local politics and in local planning. And I also ground this in theories about the racialization of space, particularly how suburbia has come to be a space in which race is fundamentally constructed through landscapes, right? And so we can think about the notion of the racialization of space as one in which, if we know that race is a socially constructed idea, we also can imagine that race is a spatially constructed idea. And there's several writers that talk about the ways in which race, and particularly whiteness, has really been constructed through ideas about suburbia, right? And so in the post-war period, when you had a lot of working and middle-class whites moving out to suburbs, you also had ideas about whiteness that became instantiated within the landscape itself. But those who study urban history also know that many of these same processes of suburbanization and the ways in which the American dream became crystallized in suburbs and associated with white middle-class families were also based upon policies of exclusion of non-white and non-middle-class groups. And so the ways in which suburbia really crystallized that notion of whiteness is very much embedded in our understanding of who and what is suburban today. And if we think about the antithesis to this for non-white groups, what are the kind of spaces that make Asian America, right? That make Asianness in America. We oftentimes think about the Chinatowns and the Little Japans and other kinds of ethnic enclaves in cities who in many ways represent what Asianness means in America. And so this idea of the forever foreigner that Asian Americans sort of occupy in the imagination of many in the U.S. also comes out of notions about Chinatown and these othered spaces inside of cities that never quite conformed and never quite blended in with the landscape. And so many of the images of very early Chinatowns, like the one that you see on the left-hand side, are put in contrast to the quote-unquote American family, which is largely this white European family that then is contrasted with the seedy and dark places of Chinatowns. And these places continue to be exotified today and otherized today in ways that I think reflect on the ways in which Asian Americans are seen within broader society. And so I ask about the ways, if space is fundamentally constituted in the ways in which we think about the non-white others in America, how is the politics of space in suburbs today also reconstituting ideas about minorities and minorityness in the U.S.? So I began this work through a process that some have called Shoeleather Research. And that is simply walking around the places in which I think about as pretty interesting places and beginning to ask questions. I credit Paul Groth in geography with a lot of my research methods, because he really talks about really thinking about and looking at places carefully and beginning to ask questions about why places are the way they are. And for me, when I came to Berkeley and I was looking for places to study, I really began with pulling out a bunch of maps of the area and beginning to try to understand processes and patterns of racial and class segregation in the Bay Area. And so I was looking for those kind of interstitial spaces where groups were coming together in curious ways that I didn't really understand. So when I began my process, I began with those maps, and I began with diversity index maps of the area, and I expected that when I went out to these places that I would be spending most of my time in San Francisco and Oakland and places where I expected to find diversity in the landscape. But instead, I ended up spending a lot of time in Hercules and Richmond and Vallejo and eventually in the Silicon Valley, places that I didn't expect to see so much diversity. And so in Fremont, the place where I ended up spending the majority of my research time, I was intrigued by places like the Little Cobble Market that seemed to represent the coming together of so many different groups in one space. But I was also intrigued by the ways in which these places that are seemingly so diverse also represent sort of fragments and the politics that these places underwent in the process of change. And so I began talking to people like the owner of the Little Cobble Market and others about the kind of questions that I had about why these places were changing so rapidly, and also what were the politics behind landscape changes such as this. And I began to hear different stories from residents, from politicians, from school teachers, from store owners about what landscape change and what demographic change had meant in this region. And that is where I came up with the categories that I talk about in the book in terms of schools, homes, and these Asian malls, because these were the changes that were most notable to residents themselves about what immigration and what demographic change had really meant in the region. But I also began to see that there were vastly different ways in which people were conceptualizing these changes. And so for many different immigrants, they talked about these changes as really critical to the ways in which they were reshaping identities and a sense of place and a sense of belonging in these landscapes. And from older residents and oftentimes politicians, I began to see that there was a real sense of tension and contestation and a sense of a different kind of marginalization that was happening around who they thought these landscapes belonged to and who felt a sense of belonging around them. So that began to frame my questions. And eventually I came to talk to about 75 residents in terms of doing in-depth interviews. I did a total of 130 interviews altogether, some of which were not in-depth. I spent a lot of time sitting in city council meetings and also school rooms and classrooms and people's homes to do this research. So it was a long time in coming. These maps are not very clear because they're so small in this PDF version, but this really gives you a sense of how rapidly the Silicon Valley has changed in the last 30 years. So the map on the left is from what I call the core Silicon Valley cities. You could argue about whether this actually represents core Silicon Valley cities, but nonetheless you can see that in 1980 the vast majority of cities in Silicon Valley had less than a 10% Asian American population. But by 2010 there are at least 5 majority Asian American cities in the Silicon Valley, including the city of Fremont, where I spent the majority of my research, and which is the largest of those majority Asian American cities. And I refer to in the book as this is the new gold mountain, because I really feel that for a previous generation of immigrants that were coming and moving into Chinatowns in San Francisco and Oakland, that was a particular vision of what American prosperity and opportunity meant. But for a new generation of immigrants that have come, particularly in the post-1990 period to the Bay Area, this suburban vision of opportunity is much more centered on places like what we're talking about in the context of schools, Asian malls, and new home opportunities, and particularly centered around the opportunities in high tech. And so I talk about in the history chapter the drivers of this reconstituted vision of what opportunity means. Just to give you a sense of how quickly this population has shifted in Fremont in particular, this is the numbers from 1960 to 2010. If you look at that top bar, it's the percentage of white Americans in the city of Fremont going from in 1960, 98% to in 2010, 33%, and Asian Americans going from 2% to 51% today. And at the same time, the median income The foreign-born population has risen to about 43%, and the median household income is about $87,000. So it has gotten more immigration, more diverse, but also become a more prosperous community in the process. So the first chapter of the book really talks about the politics of schools and how schools have been such a driver of neighborhood change for throughout the valley. So for many Asian immigrants who are locating into the region or who are locating around the region, schools are really one of the central drivers of neighborhood change and neighborhood choice, especially for those with young kids. So over and over again, when I asked families why they had located to certain neighborhoods, schools were the number one driver. And so I talk about how much schools have driven the patterns of immigration for and location for Asian American families, not only regionally, where folks are settling inside the Silicon Valley, but also transnationally, and even families making choices to immigrate to the U.S. in order to put their kids into quote-unquote good American schools. And so you see, even within places like Fremont, different patterns of settlement that really focuses on where the quote-unquote good schools are located. And those are as measured by API scores, or the Academic Performance Index, the standard test scores for California. And so anyone with a flag noted here is one that's rated as a 10 on the API index. And you can see that where the greatest number of Asian Americans are living in Fremont are inside that blue district, which is known as the Mission San Jose School District. And I talk a lot in this chapter about what is driving this change and what it means for Asian immigrants, parents in particular, to put their kids into Mission San Jose schools. And in part, this is to sort of confront directly the idea of the model minority myth, which posits Asian Americans as sort of being culturally driven by these values that then discredits the outcomes of a lot of other groups. And so I talk in this chapter specifically to those ideas, and I look at some of the drivers of parents' decisions to put their kids into the schools. And what I try to show is that there's a lot of vulnerabilities of Asian American parents that are driving the kind of anxieties in a lot of ways that parents feel about getting their kids into the school. So Irene, talking about her own experience, I think encapsulates a lot of the comments that I heard from parents that were oftentimes talking about how they themselves might have good jobs in Silicon Valley, but they were the first generation of wealth, and they were the first in their generation to quote unquote succeed. So how she's trying to pass on this kind of inheritance to her child, because there's they don't have any, she doesn't feel like she has anything else to sort of pass on to her children besides sort of the value of education. And even though Irene lives in a very nice house in Silicon Valley, she still has this extreme anxiety over whether or not her children are going to be able to succeed in the same way that she is. And so this idea of sort of an inheritance when you lack other sort of forms of wealth stuck out very much in the ways in which parents describe their own experience and the value of that education. Nonetheless, the culture of schools have been vastly changed because of Asian immigration into this particular school. So there's a lot of anxiety over grades. There's a lot of changing school culture around science and math curriculums, around testing in the schools. There's been a lot of changes around the sports culture in the schools. So Asian Americans' presence in the schools have been associated with a lot of the shift towards a more rigorous academic culture and less of a focus on a science and math-based curriculum. And there's many examples of the ways in which this plays out in terms of the number of valedictorians every year that have over a 4.0 GPA, as well as the sports teams and other things at the campus. But this has all been very much sort of centered upon people's notions about what Asian immigration has really, how Asian immigration has really changed the school culture in places like Mission. And so part of the argument of this chapter has been what this has actually meant not only for Asian immigrants coming in to neighborhoods like Mission San Jose, but also white flight out of the school district and out of places like Mission San Jose. So this notion of the new white flight is something that actually came out in a Wall Street Journal article a few years ago, but it hasn't gotten much attention. But I see some of these same patterns happening inside Mission San Jose. And this is specifically about parents deciding to pull their kids out of schools in which where the culture has been changing, particularly shifting away from kind of a liberal arts education and more towards STEM, and this sort of this idea of the upping of the ante, and a place in which white kids, as this teacher is talking about, are no longer able to compete against the Asian Americans in the schools. And this is so what the teacher is talking about here is what she's seen other parents that are leaving these school districts saying about why they're pulling their kids out. And so this notion around the traditional regular high school that's amenable to a regular kid is something that I heard over and over again, sort of norming the white experience, the white high school, the traditional American high school, against sort of what Asian Americans were supposedly bringing into and changing the schools into this more sort of foreign presence, and that driving a lot of the decision of parents to leave the school district. I talk a lot in this chapter about the sort of how these districts, how the politics of school boundaries really catalyzed a lot of the racial tensions and issues that were alive and well inside the Mission District, and particularly the decision of the school district to redistrict and reboundary so that a lot of Asian American kids went from the Mission High District into the Irvington High District. I don't think I have time to fully go into the case, but I'll be happy to sort of talk about this in Q&A because it's a pretty interesting case around how school policy really was fundamentally integrated into a lot of the politics of race in the neighborhood. I'd like to now talk about the so-called Asian Mall, and this term really comes out of much of my interviews where I was going out to these shopping centers and I was asking, and there's a lot of shopping centers that have been purpose-built by developers, Asian American developers, largely for Asian businesses, or these are strip malls that have been converted into shopping centers with a lot of Asian businesses, and many folks refer to these as the Asian Mall. So you can think about the Ranch 99 Center in Albany, someplace that I visited quite regularly, living here, as this kind of typology of place. And so the title, Mainstreaming the Asian Mall, really refers to a lot of the politics that have centered around this kind of shopping center development in the Valley, and particularly the regulations that have focused in on these malls as a typology. And what I argue in this chapter is that many of these regulations have sort of made these malls more mainstream and function and look like more traditional American shopping centers. But I begin with sort of thinking about the importance of these shopping centers for Asian American families. And so I argue that these shopping centers are really centers of suburban social and cultural life. These are community centers. They are suburban main streets. They are places where families come together on a regular basis. They are diverse in their constitution in terms of Pan-Asian businesses and consumers, and so they have a lot of meaning for families who regularly visit them. But nonetheless, they are contested places. There has been in the city of Fremont a lot of critique of these places from established residents, sort of this idea that there are too many and too many Asian malls, that every shopping center is being converted into an Asian mall. There's been a lot of talk about these malls as exclusionary space, that they are non-welcoming to non-Asian residents, and that people don't feel comfortable to come into places that have Asian language signage and others. And they're not only critiqued from residents themselves, but a lot of city officials and planners have also critiqued these malls for some of the same reasons, but oftentimes for being kind of a messy kind of mall. The Asian mall, one of the things that really characterizes the Asian mall as different from other kinds of mall typologies is this idea of condo ownership. And so in most retail shopping centers, you have sort of a leased space that occupants then lease their space, and then they pay like to the landlord. But in many Asian malls, you have a condo form of ownership where people actually own the retail space. And what this has led to is a lot of people subleasing out different spaces. You also just have more signage and more smaller kind of spaces that are really good for entrepreneurs, for ethnic entrepreneurs to make their way into these malls. However, many of the regulations that have centered on these malls, in not only in Fremont but elsewhere, have really centered around pushing back against a lot of the characteristics that I would say really make the Asian mall the Asian mall. So, for instance, in Fremont, in the early 2000s, they established condo regulations that just focused on retail. And really, there is no retail condos other than Asian malls. So it really did focus in on the Asian mall as a particular typology. And the regulations that were passed did things like regulated the amount of visibility you have in the windows. So this is Fremont Times Square. This is the first condo-owned mall that was built in Fremont that utilized these regulations, and you can see the amount. There's nothing plastering in the windows of this mall. The other thing that these regulations did is that they created a minimum square footage for the retail space inside. So you couldn't do a lot of these really smaller spaces. You had to have a minimum square foot for the space. And so a lot of the smaller businesses that were characteristic of these malls were not present in this mall. And the other thing is that this idea of sort of the unhealthy clustering of businesses, which is something that I heard over and over from planners, is that there's just too many restaurants in these malls. This can't be supported. But in fact, if you talk to residents about why they go to the mall, it's oftentimes as a food court, because these are places where a lot of food is served. But what they did in the case of Fremont Times Square is they regulated the amount of eateries that you could have in the mall through their parking requirements. And because everything requires a certain parking ratio, they were not able to have a certain number of eateries. And then the final thing that I think they did in this particular development that really changed the nature of the mall itself was that in many of the malls, because they're condo ownership, nobody sort of has more of a stake in the mall than others. But in this case, Marina Foods, they negotiated with Marina Foods so that Marina Foods itself had a 51% stake in the development. And this was so that if the city wanted to redevelop the property, that they only had to go to one owner instead of all the other owners of the mall. So it really did clear the way for the city to have more control and ownership, and if this property was to be redeveloped into the future, that the city didn't have so many obstacles to redevelopment. The other thing that the city of Fremont has really done, on the one hand, you see that there's been sort of a pushback against these malls and more regulation over the kind of development and the face of the malls. But on the other hand, the city has really has really embraced a certain vision of diversity in the landscape vis-a-vis the Asian Mall. And so this very fuzzy picture comes out of the design ideas for their downtown redevelopment, where the city has for a long time been trying to figure out what is going to happen with redevelopment in the downtown. And one of the ideas is to sort of bring diversity and highlight and showcase that diversity in the downtown. And so Asian malls have been have been floated as an idea to really showcase that diversity in the downtown. And I think nowhere is this idea of diversity being for sale and being a kind of consumptive item for the city that really helps with its economic development and is not really about making a space for the residents of the city, is in the example of the Globe Mall. So this mall development proposal was one that was proposed by an Asian mall developer that had done a lot of work in San Jose and had built a lot of Asian malls in that area. But when he came to Fremont, he had a very different idea of what he was going to do. And some said it was because of the kind of pushback that the city had given to other mall projects that he didn't really feel like that just an Asian mall was going to do. So in fact, what he proposed was what he called the Globe, which is this mall that represents different ethnic groups from all over the world. And so in this mall, you have a space for Little Europea, a place for Little Africa, a place for Australia, a place for many different parts of the world. It was the second largest shopping center in the city of Fremont, if built, which it never was. But it received a lot of support by the city council, by the planning commission, and by planners on the ground. And part of the reason that I argue that this proposal was so attractive is that it represented much of what the Asian mall was not. And so while many people critiqued the Asian mall for being exclusionary and non-welcoming, this was the most welcoming vision of a mall you could imagine, right? It was welcoming to those from all over the globe. What actually happened with this project is that the financial crisis hit in the late 2000s, and the developer did not go forward with the proposal for the whole shopping center. The only part of the mall that actually got built is that small corner there on the right-hand side, which is the Asian mall portion of the project. And so in the minds of many planners, city officials, and established residents, it became just another Asian mall in the city. And for the rest of my time, I'd like to talk about the last chapter of the book, where I've focused on the controversies over the rebuilding of homes in the city of Fremont, into this form that some call the monster home and others derisively call McMansions. And this is a form of home that has really gone alongside of immigration. So much of this home building phenomenon, these too large homes, were built out in the 1990s, and this is not only in Silicon Valley, but throughout the U.S. This was a time of large home development. This is the run-up to the dot-com boom, where there's a lot of wealth in the Silicon Valley. This is also the real estate bubble, where a lot of these homes are being built on greenfield McMansion sites, greenfield sites like you see here in the Mission San Jose district. But this is also the time of a lot of immigration. So who are moving into these homes in the Silicon Valley are oftentimes Asian immigrants. And while these kind of developments on these greenfield sites were in many ways controversial to the city, most of the controversies centered on areas in which these homes were being built in established neighborhoods, like here in Mission Ranch. And so these pictures show sort of a ranch-style home in an established neighborhood next to a home that was rebuilt into this style that some might call the McMansion. And in this chapter, I focus on the kind of tensions that this rebuilding process really catalyzed between particularly Chinese immigrants and established residents in a few particular neighborhoods in Fremont. And so because so many of these homes that were being occupied and rebuilt were rebuilt by Chinese immigrants, this process really became one that really caused a lot of tension around immigration in neighborhoods like Mission Ranch. And I argue here that that the supporters of the McMansions and those that were rebuilding their homes had fundamentally different ways of seeing their homes and their neighborhoods than established residents who pushed back. And many of the arguments around these homes really centered on these different visions of what a home and a neighborhood was. And so I tell this story, I'll tell this story today, at least through the view of Daniel Lau and his wife, who moved into the Mission Ranch neighborhood in the early 1980s. And when they moved into their home, they moved into it largely because their home was located 2 blocks from Mission San Jose High School. And they really wanted to send their daughters to the high school. And they did. In fact, they had 3 daughters that graduated from Mission San Jose High School and are doing quite well today. But they also talked about how when they bought their home, they never bought the home for the house itself. It was always about the schools. And so when they moved into the house, Daniel's wife sort of complained about the stinky carpet and the older home, and it only had 2 bedrooms for their 3 daughters, and they really desired a different kind of home. So Daniel doesn't work in Silicon Valley in the high-tech industry, but he works in a sort of industry that services the high-tech. And after they had been in the Silicon Valley for a while, he had accumulated enough wealth to be able to really build his dream house. So on that very same lot that you see him and his wife standing in front of, he has now rebuilt his dream home on that very same lot. And to many of the neighbors, this rebuilding process really spoke a lot to sort of the ways in which these homes sort of destroyed a sense of community, and the ugliness of these homes and their unfit, how unfit they were with the neighborhood itself. But if you talk to Daniel and his wife about why they decided to rebuild and also what this home represents to them, it's a very different vision. So Daniel became somewhat of an amateur architect in the process of rebuilding these homes. He showed me the drawings that he had worked on himself and the programs that he had purchased in order to figure out how to rebuild the home in exactly the way that he wanted. In fact, that little cupola in the front of the house is a place where he had self-designed for his Christmas tree to go, because in his old home he could never figure out exactly where the Christmas tree was going to go. There's a custom walk kitchen inside the house. There are master bedrooms on the top floor and the bottom floor because, well, currently, at least at the time that we talked, only his wife and himself were living in the home. They had built out the home as a multi-generational home for their daughters to be able to move in and eventually send their grandchildren on to Mission San Jose High. So this was really a vision for him of his dream home, and he talks about it architecturally as a beautiful home that represents much of what he desired. But if you go just down the street from Daniel, I spent a lot of time talking to this family who was one of the prime opponents of the rebuilding process in this neighborhood. And we spent the majority of the time not inside the home but outside the home in their garden talking about why they were so opposed to the rebuilding practices of people like Daniel. And they talked about how they had grown up in these ranch-style neighborhoods in California, and to them this really represented a strong sense of community, that the ranch-style home and the extension of the home into the outdoors was really the kind of lifestyle that they had grown up around and really represented the kind of neighborhood that they want and this kind of friendly atmosphere that they had known. They talked about how if there was a McMansion built next door, that it would destroy the sense of privacy, which is one of the things that they had come to enjoy so much about their home. So it was fundamentally different ideas about what a home and a community really meant inside of these homes. And while these kind of controversies happened throughout the Silicon Valley and throughout the city of Fremont, the two neighborhoods that fought the hardest, the longest, and eventually won regulations for their neighborhoods were two of the most exclusive neighborhoods in Fremont. This is Mission Ranch and Glenmore Gardens. That were some of the last neighborhoods to change in the city of Fremont. And these neighborhoods were able to get design guidelines and development standards put in place in their neighborhoods that really prioritized the visions and the desires of established residents as opposed to those who are moving in and rebuilding their homes. And so these are from the actual design guidelines that still exist in Fremont about what the city would like to encourage in terms of design and what they want to discourage. So if you are rebuilding your home in a Mission Ranch and you go to apply to a permit from the planning department, they're going to ask you what kind of materials are you using on your home. And if your home looks anything like the one on the left, they're going to discourage the use of stucco or these or tile roofings or these oval windows, as opposed to encouraging the kind of style that you see here on the right-hand side, which is the traditional ranch-style home. And the other thing that the city did is they put in place new development standards for these two neighborhoods. So while prior to the guidelines being, or the development standards being changed in the Mission Ranch neighborhood and Glenmore Gardens, you could build Daniel's house essentially, which is about a 7,000 square foot home, with the top floor and the bottom floor being about equal in terms of its square footage. But according to the new development guidelines or development standards in the neighborhood, if you want to build a 2-story home in that neighborhood, you're only able to build about 3,000 square foot home, which is about the same size as many of those ranch style homes. And if you want to build a second story and build out a multi-generational home as Daniel and his wife desired to do, you can't actually do that in these neighborhoods anymore, because all you can build on the second floor is is that square footage that is shaded there, which some refer to as the submarine home, because you can really only build sort of an attic little space onto the top rather than the full square footage of the bottom floor. So it less than cut in half the amount of square footage that you can build, and fundamentally made that structure, the multi-generational home, impossible in the neighborhood. And I argue that the reasons for this was not only that these neighborhoods fought the hardest and the longest for regulations in their neighborhood, but also because what the arguments that they were making were able to be heard by city councils, by planning commissions, because they fundamentally agreed with a lot of our planning norms about what constitutes good and appropriate development in suburban places. So this idea about it being sort of architecturally unfit for the neighborhood, that this idea that we have to build around existing contexts really struck a chord with many, like Mayor Bob Mosserman, who says, usually I'm very pro-development and I'll let a lot of things sort of go, but in this case, this was just sort of over the line, and I heard this many times, and it oftentimes referred back to what many of these basic planning principles about stability and context in a neighborhood that we take as a given in many places. But I would argue that if suburbs are changing, as cities are changing, as neighborhoods are changing in ways and becoming more diverse ethnically and economically, then we have to be making space for different forms and norms in our suburban communities. And so we have to allow our landscapes to change in the same way in which some of the classic post-war suburbs have actually changed. So if you think about Levittown, this very classic post-war suburbs that we associate so much with the middle class and very homogeneous idea of the American family, if you look at that same suburb today, it has vastly changed in terms of its form, because it was, in fact, never the kind of homogeneous place that we imagined, right? There were different family structures that occupied these spaces. There were different identities, there are different desires of families. And many people over the years in those very same homes have added on to their homes. They've restructured them in ways that fit their desired lifestyles. And so you can see that the footprint as well as the house style itself has changed, even in places that we think of as static, like Levittown. And I would argue that if we are trying to make our suburban and our urban landscapes more just and inclusive, we also have to be planning and designing for that kind of change in the landscape. And much of our suburban, particularly design and planning norms, have really tried to put in place a kind of static vision of these places. And as our landscapes and as our cities and communities become more diverse, we need to find ways for making these places open up to different desires and visions and norms for these places, and these need to be constituted through our design regulations and our planning mechanisms. And so I'll close just by reading a short passage from the ending of the book in which I talk about some of the what my time in Fremont really taught me about looking at places like here in my own neighborhood in Shepherd Park in Washington, D.C., where this home is so I don't live in the suburbs, but I live in a neighborhood that you could call suburban because it is very much the sort of typology of home that you see there. And then when I went walking through my neighborhood and I saw this home, my first reaction was, why would somebody dig up their front yard and build a model of Jamaica, which is actually what that front yard is? And so if I had an aerial view, you would be able to see that whole concrete patio is actually a map of Jamaica with various points like Negril and Ocho Rios and everything. And there's various sort of markers from each of those towns there. And so, I was sort of curious why anybody would do that. And my first reaction was, oh, how ugly. But I've come to really appreciate landscapes like this as sort of one way in which places are making a place for difference in the landscape. And I think that the more that we can design our regulations to actually encourage folks to be making these kind of idiosyncratic changes to the landscape, I think the more we are opening up our landscapes to change. So let me again close with a passage from the conclusion of the book. My time in Fremont taught me the value of affirming landscapes of difference as an important part of every community and how radical expressions of difference in urban space can be. Landscapes of difference challenge existing social hierarchies and positionalities and make room for new social meanings, identities, and forms, as well as new forms of civic and social belonging. Nowadays, when I pass through the side streets of my neighborhood or any number of other places, I am more attentive to the subtle stories that landscapes tell about the diverse people, contested politics, and complex processes that produce them. I gain inspiration from kitschy lawn figurines, odd house colors, and other idiosyncratic design decisions that seem to have something to say about the people who live there. I'm not looking for window dressings, but instead for genuine expressions of an occupant's identity that I read as bold claims for a set of precious rights that have receded in tandem with suburban growth. Thank you. Oh, I can take questions. So I think we have about 25 minutes, and I'd love to field some questions and have a more robust discussion. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
So I think it's a fascinating topic, and I'm interested in sort of the cultural dimension of your kind of explanatory scheme, because on both the housing front and the school front, you basically argued implicitly that Asian immigrants in these communities have a different culture, right, in some way with regard to academic achievement, and also like the way that they want to structure their family life inside the house, right? Or at least it was seen as distinctive by non-Asians. Could you please expand kind of on that idea? Because that seems to be at the root
Sure. So I would argue that it's not only cultural, but it's also economic and social. I mean, these are sort of paths of mobility for immigrants. And so it's not, I sort of try both to sort of walk the cultural line in terms of not making these arguments solely about Asian culture believes in education, right? And this is what I was talking about with regard to the schools chapter, is that I try to explain the ways in which selective immigration, how schooling in China actually has sort of pushed particular models of education, and how economic mobility is kind of filtered through the idea of excellence in schools. So it's not simply a cultural argument, it's also about an economic mobility in terms of the ways in which parents conceive of the value of education. It is a path to upward mobility for them and their families. And in the same way, I do talk about that within the context of this McMansion development. And so for many families that are rebuilding, they say this is a path to wealth building, right? And so I've bought into a neighborhood where my square footage was supposed to be 7,000 square foot on my house, and now you've reduced it to 3,000 square foot. That's a taking. That's taking part of the value of my property, and I bought into this neighborhood not only because part of the path to mobility for me and my children was to be able to get into the schools, but also to be able to maximize the value of my investment in my home. So it's both an argument around sort of how the home itself represents that expression of perhaps cultural value and how people constitute their homes and their neighborhoods, but also an economic or a social argument around how people sort of see themselves generating wealth and social mobility and economic mobility.
But that part of the argument would be somewhat specific to Silicon Valley, where property prices are increasing exponentially and where the tech economy is booming and so on, right? So, for example, I was interested to hear what you found in Vallejo, which is not nearly as closely tied, right, to the Silicon Valley boom. And whether there was a different dynamic there in terms of the schooling and also the housing. And so, right, because...
Yeah, well, I didn't spend much time in Vallejo, so I don't know the dynamics. So I would be curious if somebody had something to say about what the dynamics of Vallejo are. But I don't think that the dynamics are unique to Silicon Valley in terms of the priorities that many immigrants hold over education for their children and wealth building vis-a-vis home purchases, and oftentimes also entrepreneurship via starting businesses such as in the Asian mall. So I would say, again, I'd sort of walk that line between sort of a political economy of these places and also the sort of cultural arguments.
Yeah, thank you. I'm really excited to read the book. I wanted to ask about where your case fits in the larger context of the suburbs and what's happening. I feel like a lot of the literature is focused on the suburbanization of poverty, and particularly with the increase of income in your case of Fremont. Where does that fit in terms of like this increasing diversity and immigrant concentrations in the suburbs, but also potentially some places that are experiencing more growth in poverty rather than growth in affluence?
Yeah. So my second book is about suburbanization of poverty. So it's not, and in fact, when I did these maps of the Bay Area, and I went out to places, Richmond and Vallejo and Hercules and other places that I was going, had experienced a lot of growth in suburban poverty. And so one opportunity was to write a book on that. But I chose to actually write the book on something that I felt was really compelling that I didn't really understand. So that's why I ended up in Silicon Valley. But I think what the literature has said is that, that immigrants are no longer, wealthy immigrants nor poor immigrants are no longer locating directly into center cities. They are locating into suburbs. So suburbs are becoming fragments of wealth and poverty at the same time. And so I think it's just as important that we focus both on trends in terms of where poverty is moving to, as well as where new pockets of concentrated wealth and who make up those pockets. But even in the Silicon Valley, had I done something on San Jose or even Newark, which is kind of a little pocket within in Fremont, it would be very different in terms of the constitution of this community, of who the immigrants are and what the class dynamics are. Because Fremont really represents a sort of middle or even upper middle class suburban community, but there's also communities that are in the Silicon Valley that are far poorer, that have different makeups. And even within Fremont, there are different sort of pockets of poverty, or at least more working class immigrants that are present there in the community. So for instance, it has one of the largest population of Afghanis outside of Afghanistan who occupy the Centerville neighborhood and are much more sort of working class immigrants than those that I feature most strongly in the book. So I think all of these trends are really important, that we understand that suburbs are not homogeneous in any way, and that we understand the different drivers of change and the different constitutions. So read my second book for the next trends. Yeah.
So I'm curious about the school districting, the boundaries of that. It seems like some of these issues would overlap and the tensions would be heightened around like purchasing a home within a district, and then the regulations around design for those homes in terms of like when folks are trying to change the homes. Could you talk a little bit about how that played out?
Yeah, so in the Mission Ranch neighborhood, for instance, that was a neighborhood that many Asian immigrants moved into after school redistricting happened in Fremont. So what happened is that the schools were becoming overcrowded, particularly inside the Mission District, because a lot of immigrants were placing their kids into schools, and it was becoming those were becoming the most heavily impacted schools in terms of the numbers, and other schools were under-enrolled, like Irvington High, which is a much more working class white school. And so when the school district decided to redistrict, they took one of the elementary schools that had at the time was the highest performing elementary school and had the largest concentration of Asian American families, and they redistricted to Irvington. And after that happened, a lot of families left that neighborhood, and they moved into places like Mission Ranch in order to keep their kids inside the Mission San Jose school district. So that chapter on the rebuilding of those homes, a lot of those families were families that had moved from the former Mission district into the new Mission district to keep their kids. So those processes were very much caught up in the politics of schools at the time. And so these were families that were living in perhaps homes that were much bigger than their ranch-style homes in other neighborhoods, but now they had to sort of they were working to keep their kids inside of that district, and so they could afford to build bigger, and so they were moving into a neighborhood that they were able to do that. So it was the schools and the homes were very much sort of processes of neighborhood change that were working alongside of each other.
Yeah, I had a similar question along the lines as the first one, but maybe rather than thinking of the counterfactual case in Vallejo where you didn't go, within those people you talked to, did you notice, like I'm just, the story of the housing and the schools to me could just be a story of gentrification in the suburbs. There are similar things in the suburbs I grew up in where you had a wealthier group of white people coming in who could be called the trespassers, and poorer whites having similar reactions to some of these things. Mm-hmm. And so I was wondering, did you talk to, was there specific Asian, say, resentment among like wealthier people as opposed to poorer people? What was specifically Asian about the house? I mean, the mall story seemed clear to me with the cultural inflection, but just to hear a little more about how you're thinking about class and this particular Asian cultural dynamic.
Yeah, so that's a great question. Again, the folks that I profile most prominently here are largely middle or upper middle class Asian immigrant families. However, there are moments in each of the chapters where I talk about sort of families who don't fit, either for reasons of class or ethnicity. And so, for instance, in the schools chapter, I profile a second-generation Asian American who actually went here to Berkeley, and he talked about going to Mission San Jose High and her mother being a working class single mom who was working several jobs and who wasn't able to support all the after-school activities that others were doing, and she didn't quite sort of measure up to the model minority myth, and how that affected her social identity and her performance in schools and what that meant for her social milieu in the schools, even though she was Asian. So she was supposed to, many of the stereotypes sort of pushed her towards this model minority myth. Her class failure and the restraints of her class really, she felt like, was something that that limited her ability to sort of reach that norm or that standard. And so I talk in that chapter about the different class dynamics for those who don't measure up and who also aren't able to take advantage of this kind of opportunities that many of the upper middle class families are able to take, that really push the performance of Asian immigrants. I also, in the homes chapter, talk about how that there were many neighborhoods in which this was happening that were not the upper middle income neighborhoods, like Mission Ranch and Glenmore Gardens. In those neighborhoods, they did not receive the same kind of regulations that you had in place in these two neighborhoods, particularly because, as the mayor said, these, usually he's a pro-development mayor, so in many of these other neighborhoods, he just saw it as improving the neighborhoods, whereas in these particular neighborhoods, he saw it as something that was destroying, these very highly valued neighborhoods in the Mission Ranch neighborhood. And I don't talk necessarily about the class dynamics amongst Asian Americans, but I do talk about how there were differences of opinions amongst Asian Americans about the value of these homes. And so some that I talked to were like, yeah, that is an ugly house, and so it also seemed to be something that was more prevalent amongst Chinese immigrants, and so other Asian ethnic groups, particularly Indians, were more critical of the rebuilding processes that were happening there. And so I toured with one lady who showed me all the ugly houses in her neighborhood, and she was a renter, which was very unique in the Mission Ranch area. And so there were different dynamics amongst both class, generation. So if you're a first-generation immigrant versus if you have been born here or have been there a while, there are differences of opinions across all these different issue areas. So it's very much a part of sort of the way I've thought about these issues. Harpreet.
Thank you very much, Willow, for a very fascinating talk. Since we talked last time when I was living in Fremont, I wonder if you have come across this thing that I've observed that number of Indians who were living in Fremont are now moving to San Ramon, particularly for the same reason that they were moving to Fremont because of the school district. And this is something that I have observed, and I would love what you think about it. Since 2012 that I have been visiting and living off and on in San Ramon, what I have seen is that particularly I'm talking about the Windmere-Dorothy School District.
So, I'm sorry,
Windmere and Dorothy School District in San Ramon, most of the white families have moved out, and the community has become very Asian homogeneous in the sense people are doctors, people are Silicon Valley engineers. And whenever I go out for Halloween trick-or-treating, I see less and less of white families that I saw last year. And one of the common things, if you talk to people, they say that they are very tired of all the competition in the school. They cannot have their children go through. One of the people used the word trauma of at such a young age of being so competitive. In fact, so competitive is the school district that there is this test, I'm forgetting the name, for second graders, and all of them appear. and those who are in 98 percentile, they go to a special class. In this school district, 99% of the class cleared that, and all of them are now in one class, which means basically they had to create more classes. And I was wondering what you feel about this sort of a strange homogeneous structures being created. And secondly, if you also saw, like in Asian American, it's like a huge umbrella group, particularly within Indian and Chinese. I see lots and lots of competition, and like you mentioned about those MEC mentions, Indians not very fond of about how Chinese Americans were creating them. If you saw that in the way they approach schools and education also, because from my from what I have observed in conversations, Indians are very proud of the fact that we are not helicopter parents like the Chinese are, but I think they are the same, and in fact more. So I'm just wondering if
So all the observations that you made are very prescient to the ways and things that I observed in Fremont. So many of the families talked about how, they were looking to San Ramon and many of these other up and coming communities that had good schools, new homes, and why were they paying so much to buy into the mission when they could just move to San Ramon? So it was sort of the next suburb that a lot of families were looking at. And in fact, in the chapter, I talk about this pattern of that many established white families call Asian overflow, of sort of moving from the patterns of Mission San Jose spilling out into other suburbs that have good schools as well. And so it's not just a Mission San Jose phenomenon, but it is something that where good schools and often new homes are being built. You see a lot of these same patterns of Asian immigration. And you see, I think, these same patterns of white flight happening as you're describing over and over in these school districts as well. And I do talk about in the book how I spend a lot of time talking about sort of inter-ethnic relationships, and particularly relationships between Indians and Chinese inside the schools, and some of the tensions are even like inter-Chinese tensions between Chinese and Taiwanese students and competition, and how these social relations and competition amongst groups actually work. And so I did find that a lot of people, that a lot of the conversation was not Asians versus white, but Asians versus Asians in schools, and different dynamics of different thoughts about parenting. But in general, Indians and Chinese look a lot more alike than Chinese and whites, and so they often, with regard to sort of what is driving neighborhood change, it was often parents aligning along the side that education and test scores are the most important things that are driving their decisions around where to live, and that was not the case for many of the white families that I talked to. Although it wasn't not important, they felt oftentimes that their kids could compete better and certainly graduate in the top 15% of their class to get into like a Berkeley or a UCLA if they were not in such competitive schools in schools in which they were able to take other kinds of extracurricular activities that could pad their resumes in other ways.
So I really appreciated your opening where you juxtapose the long-established notions of the American dream with the new American dream. And so I kept thinking back of that American dream as a point of reference, particularly within urban planning. And so you presented 3 domains that are being drastically changed by this immigrant community. And I'm wondering about things that you were surprised that aren't changing, or things that are only changing minimally. And thinking about urban planning, for example, transportation was a huge part of the suburbs, literature and parks. Are there other areas, churches or anything else that you didn't discuss because of the lack of space, because space constraints, or that you think aren't changing at all?
Well, I'm actually writing a article right now on faith-based institutions and change, so I won't say that those are not changed. There's a lot of mosque Hindu temples, Thai Buddhist temples, and other kinds of faith-based institutions that are really reshaping themselves in Silicon Valley. So I'd say that's an area that is definitely one that has changed, as well as parks and playgrounds and the uses of public space. So I would say that is another area that I see a lot of change in the way that these places are used. I would say that I would say more of the spaces that I see, well, I would say that to me what is somewhat surprising is how much of the new American dream that I've described here amongst middle and upper middle class Asian immigrants is a sort of reconstituted and maybe hyper vision of sort of post-war suburbia in some ways, right? So I guess what I'm maybe more surprised by is how, in some ways, it's not that different than some of the ideas about suburbia that have pervaded suburbia for a long time. And so I think as new immigrants come in, there's ways in which these ideas are reconstituted, but using different ideas and different norms as their base, but fundamentally are still buying into wealth building via homes and schools as a trajectory towards this idea of success. And so I guess more that's my surprise, is that's not fundamentally reshifting the American dream, but perhaps creating a more hyper vision of that dream in terms of the path to mobility for new immigrants.
I think we'll have to end there, but I know Willow's able to stay for a few minutes if people have other questions. Thank you all for coming, and please join me in thanking Willow for her.